Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. passes the torch to Saul Canelo Alvarez. Before we get into this next video, make sure that you hit the like button and sub to the channel if you're not already a sub to the channel. Now, just last night, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. stepped in the ring in a big rivalry fight, exhibition bout that is, against Hector Camacho Jr. Now, if you all don't know the backstory between Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. and Hector Camacho, it goes back to the 1980s. Hector Camacho, the late great Hector Camacho Sr. and Julio Cesar Chavez, they had a rivalry dating back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. was the biggest Mexican fighter, biggest Mexican superstar there was in boxing. And also during that same time, Hector Camacho Sr. was the biggest Puerto Rican star in boxing at that time, during the early 90s and late 80s, and so they had a big rivalry. They had a big rivalry. They ended up finally stepping in the ring against each other in 1992. In 92, both of these guys were still young. They were still, in their prime. And it was a big mega fight that the fans, the Mexican fans and the Puerto Rican fans had been wanting to see for years and years, right? So this was a big showdown. Hector Camacho actually ended up losing to Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. by unanimous decision. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., he went in there and he did a pretty good job on Hector Camacho. Hector Camacho had nothing for Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. But, later on, they became good friends. They became good friends, but there was still that rivalry. So last night, Julio Cesar Chavez, he got in the ring with the son of Hector Camacho, Hector Camacho Jr., and Hector Camacho Jr., he had been saying a lot of things about Julio Cesar Chavez. He felt some type of way about Julio Cesar Chavez beating his dad back in 1992. So he still carried that ill rivalry. He still carried that. So Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. last night, he came out and he looked good. He was in great shape. I can't say the same for Hector Camacho Jr. Hector Camacho Jr. was out of shape. He was weighing over 160 pounds. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., he was around 142 or something. He was in great shape. He looked in better shape, actually, than he did when he retired from boxing. So, he's been sober for over a decade and, he's rededicated himself. He's rededicated himself to just basically staying in shape and, training. At the age of 58, you guys got to understand that Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. will be 59 years old coming up real soon. So at the age of 58, he looked in great shape. It was an exhibition bout. But Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. and Hector Camacho Jr., they went at it. They had on headgear and they was throwing bombs. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., just like his old self, he went in there, he was throwing vicious body shots, and Hector Camacho Jr., he showed that he still had the hand speed. In his 40s. Hector Camacho Jr. he's in his 40s. He's a lot younger than Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., but he is in his 40s. But, he was out of shape, but he did show that he still does have fast blazing hand speed. Now, Hector Camacho Jr., he had all the skills in the world. He was a great fighter coming up, a great young fighter coming up. Hand speed, he had power, he had all of that. He was a superb boxer. He wasn't no just vicious knockout puncher when he in his day, but he was a superb boxer with the fastest feet, fastest hand speed. But the only thing with him is he could never stay disciplined and he could never stay in shape. But anyway, like I said, they went out and they had a great fight for the fans. They put on, as this was Julio Cesar Chavez Sr.'s last fight. He said this will be his last time ever in the boxing ring. hats off to Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. After the fight, he gave all praise to Camacho and Camacho Sr. and the whole Camacho family. And if you guys don't know, Hector Camacho Sr. was gunned down in the streets of Puerto Rico back in 2012 at the age of 50. So Julio Cesar Chavez, he said that he wanted to do this for the Camacho family. He wanted to give the Camacho family one last time to be in the ring and one last time to make a lot of money, So he said this is why he did this. He did this because he said he has so much respect for the late great Hector Camacho Sr. and he wanted to do something for Hector Camacho Sr.'s family. Right. And you got to take your hats off to Julio Cesar Chavez for doing something like this. They did award the victory to Julio Cesar Chavez. He was the man that went out there. He had a higher work rate. And, at one point in time in the fight, they went at it and then they went back to their corners and they said, look, let's take the headgear off. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. said, let's take the headgear off. I don't want to fight with this headgear on. Let's get at it. And, Hector Camacho Jr., he was like, man, I don't want to do that. I don't want to hurt you. Nah, let's keep the headgear on. And then at that moment is when Saul Canelo Alvarez was in the crowd. He said, you know what? Let me get in Julio Cesar Chavez's corner. Saul Canelo Alvarez actually worked the corner for the last round of Julio Cesar Chavez. And it was great to see, Canelo Alvarez, the young, hungry lion that's taking over boxing, the Mexican superstar right now, right now, that's in the same position that Julio Cesar Chavez once was, because whether you like him or you don't, Canelo Alvarez is the face of boxing when you're talking about Mexican fighters right now. And he might be the face of all of boxing, depending on, who you ask. But like I said, it was something great to watch. Saul Canelo Alvarez working the corner of his idol. He said many, many times that Julio Cesar Chavez was always his idol. Julio Cesar Chavez was the Mexican superstar, was the Mexican fighter that all of the Mexicans looked up to, right? In the 1980s and 1990s, right? They all looked up to him. They looked at Julio Cesar Chavez like a god. And it was great to see, Saul Canelo Alvarez be able to work the corner of his idol in his idol's very last time in the ring ever. After the fight, Julio Cesar Chavez, he tells Canelo Alvarez, I'm going to pass the torch to you now. I held the pride of my country. I held the pride of Mexico on my back for many, many years. Now I'm passing the torch to you, son. Saul Canelo Alvarez is not the son of Julio Cesar Chavez, but I guarantee you that Julio Cesar Chavez wishes that his son was half the man that Canelo Alvarez is. And that's a whole different story in itself. But he told Saul Canelo Alvarez, I'm passing the torch to you, my son. I've held Mexico on my back for many, many years. Now you are the greatest fighter that we have in Mexico, right? And you may be the greatest fighter ever of all time. We don't know, you may be the greatest fighter ever of all time, but we don't know because your career is still ongoing, right? He says that we were in two different eras and you can't compare the era, but right now it is Saul Canelo Alvarez. Right? And he passed the torch to Saul Canelo Alvarez. And, you got to take your hats off to Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. for doing this, because you see a lot of fighters in the past eras and they don't want to pass the torch to the younger generation. They want to hold on to it. And a lot of them, they hate on the young fighters coming up. They hate on them just because they're not in the spotlight shining anymore. And they just can't get over that they'll never have that fame and glory that they once had. But like I said, you got to take your hat off to Julio Cesar Chavez for realizing my time is up, and now we have another great fighter that's holding Mexico down with pride, just like I did in my era. And I want to pass the torch to him because I see him as the only one capable of walking in my shoes and the only one capable of holding down my country like I did at one point. And he might do it even better, because I'm going to tell you like this. Saul Canelo Alvarez, he don't put no drugs in the system. He don't drink. He is completely focused and disciplined on boxing. So we got to give it up to, Julio Cesar Chavez for realizing that, realizing that, my time is up and it is a new era. And Saul Canelo Alvarez, you could see the joy on his face from having, his idol, the man that he grew up wanting to be like, tell him something like that. Imagine that. It doesn't matter if you play football, basketball, baseball. Imagine your idol that you grew up watching telling you, I'm passing the torch to you now because you are the best. And I see you are the only one that can do it like I did it and walk in my shoes. And you may be even able to do it greater than what I did in my era. That's great. That's great. So once again, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. passes the torch to Saul Canelo Alvarez. And you got to take your hats off to Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. looking as great as he did at the age of almost 59 years old, staying in shape and showing that he can still go out there and do it and not want to stay in the spotlight and knowing how to pass the torch to the next biggest thing. Let me know what y'all think about this. Put a comment in the comment section, and don't forget to sub to the channel and hit that like button. There you go, talking that boxing again, and I'm gone.